communication with everybody about that as we go forward. But we're really thrilled to have Professor Harry Mika here. He's here doing a research project. He's the principal investigator for a project that the National Association for Community Mediation is doing. And the project has a lot of different parts to it, but the part that brings him here is focused on community mediation programs, and in particular ones that have been around for a long time, so the kind of the older kids on the block, and CCR is one of them. He also, in the rest of his life, has for the last 9 years spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland. He's been a professor, I'm just going to read it not to mess it up, at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and has done a lot of work with conflict resolution on, as a term that I've learned is high-end violence. We're not talking about people who are first-time offenders, but serious issues of violence. And I'm going to turn it over to Harry. He's going to give a little bit more of an introduction as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a fantastic group assembled on a Friday afternoon. I think you guys really ought to get a life. but I am most appreciative. What I'd like to do a little bit is, and just for a little bit, because I tend to talk too much, and the questions are most fun here. I'll talk very briefly about some issues in restorative justice. I'm not going to give you an overview of restorative justice, but just to indicate some elements or values of restorative justice that are particularly salient in the work that I do. All right, that kind of underwrite the work that I do. Then I want to talk very little bit about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, what are called the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the period of 1968 to 1998, and one specific legacy of that trouble, which is called punishment violence, and what that is exactly, and then the programs that we devised as a community intervention into that kind of violence. And this, in my view, is the practice of community mediation, appropriate to a time and place, a particular venue in Northern Ireland. And very similar needs are in other conflict zones around the world as well. So it has that kind of currency. The question becomes at the end, and maybe something we can discuss and for you to think about, is the relevance of this sort of thing in the United States, where we are appreciably more violent than most conflict areas around the world, which is a real sobering reflection. And I'll tell you a little bit about what these programs have done and how they work and what some of the outcomes are, if that's all right with everybody. My background is as a community mediator. I mean, I began community organizing in high school, and that's kind of the umbrella of what I think I'm about and what I like to do. And community mediation, I felt, would make an important contribution to the kind of work I was trying to do, which was largely group facilitation work. And I volunteered for a number of years in Dallas, Texas at a community mediation center, again, one of the older ones in the country now, and did there a regular menu of cases from justice of the peace courts, large group violence cases that tended to have ethnic and class and religious overlays. And so there'd be sizes of this room, cases of really protracted conflict. And that's how I cut my teeth. That's how I thought the world worked in mediation. And of course didn't. I was the only sucker who would do those cases in this mediation organization. But it made a lot of sense to me, and we saw some, I thought, good result from those cases, and I did those for a number of years. And so, and since then, I've consulted with a lot of community-based justice organizations in the United States and abroad, and that's the work that I like to do, working with organizations to sustain themselves in the long haul, be more effective organizations. And I went to work in Northern Ireland in 1997. I've had invitations to work with community mediation programs in a number of countries, and as soon as my boys were old enough to hit the road, we hit the road. And in 97, I went to work in Northern Ireland. And now I'm finishing up work there. I work with philanthropies and foundations to encourage them to make risky investments in conflict areas. And they define risky investments, depending on who sits on their boards, as anything having to do with combatants and ex-combatants and combatant organizations. And that I suppose, is my specialty. And I do a lot of work with paramilitary ideas about restorative justice. There was a Secretary of Health a long time ago named Joseph Califano, and I don't know if that name rings a bell to anybody here. He got embroiled in a controversy, much like last year's controversy, on the supply of flu vaccine in the United States. And his controversy had to do with something called swine flu. And he was called to account before a Senate committee and had to make a presentation, and the senators were all politically pretty hot about this. Why did my constituency not get enough of this, et cetera. And there were a lot of allegations about not enough flu for especially vulnerable populations, the old, et cetera. And Califano was going to have a rough afternoon, and he began his presentation by calling swine flu a very slippery concept. You know, and I remember listening to this at the time and just howling, because you could just tell that this presentation was going straight down the toilet. You could not recover from making a presentation, a political presentation, beginning with an idea calling flu a slippery concept. And he didn't recover from it, and he's admitted years later that it was a poor choice of words. But it is an excellent choice of words to describe restorative justice. Internationally, restorative justice is indeed a very slippery concept. And it's embroiled in justice wars around the world, including in Northern Ireland, and we have our own here in the United States. Now, I've been involved for a while back in trying to deal with definitions of restorative justice, and unfortunately, I'm well published on definitions of restorative justice, and I regret that. I've come to appreciate that it's not easily defined and probably should never be easily defined, and it is a concept and a set of ideas and practices and aspirations that are time and place bound, culturally bound, etc. So my ideas about restorative justice are significantly more expansive than they have been in the past. And so this is the way I like to think about the concept, the idea now. I think about it as a kind of architecture that has a number of key elements to it. One of those elements is values, and one thing that restorative justice has pushed itself to do is to make explicit its values. Right? And for a lot of innovation in any area, including justice innovation, we don't just lay ourselves bare usually, but restorative justice has had this kind of propensity to lay out what its values are, and I think that's an important element of its architecture. And again, I'm not sure that I can tell you what those values might be in North America, but they may not be particularly relevant to what the restorative values ought to be in some other place. A second element of this architecture is that we would use these values as a framework around some accepted justice aims that we can't often agree on. So a justice aim might be crime prevention, or service for victims of crime, or accountability and responsibility. I mean, we have just many, many kinds of justice aims, and one element of restorative justice, of course, is to wrap what it does around these more conventional aims: offender rehabilitation, offender integration, community safety, community empowerment, whatever those aims might be. A third element in the architecture of restorative justice, I think, are the processes and techniques, some of which you practice in this room. Kind of the nitty-gritty. How do you do this stuff? Mediation might be one of those processes and techniques. Group facilitation might be another one. Right? You know, it's what we can train people up to do, individual skill sets, even organizational capacities. To do restorative justice work means finding techniques to actually accomplish what we want to accomplish, mediation being, you know, my favorite among those. A fourth element of restorative justice are the actual programs that we call restorative justice programs, or organizations that we might call restorative justice organizations that might have a defensible ethos that incorporates the values of restorative justice. Right? And the fifth element is actually an aspiration. I'm encouraged by the number of discussions I hear in communities more and more about this, and this is the aspiration for a just community, we're doing this right, if we have a collection of programs and organizations that tend towards restorative justice, are we then achieving or working towards something larger called the just community? And again, I go into some communities where people are really questioning, are we getting closer to that? But that's what they aspire to do in these communities. So I like that architecture in terms of a way of thinking and conceptualizing restorative justice. Now, having said that, let me very quickly talk about 3 values. I hope I've got 3 here. Yeah, I have 3. 3 values that have been particularly important to me. And some of these you'll know, and maybe one you'll be less familiar with. The first value has to do with harms. Any discussion of restorative justice worth its weight will focus somewhat on harms. And this is the idea that our orientation to a problem, a crisis, ought not to be a strict legal one, for example, a rule that's been broken, a law has been broken, a crime, so to speak, but rather looks at what that implies. Well, what is the outcome of this? And harm is usually what we grasp onto, that an infraction and action has resulted in somebody being harmed. Victims, for example, might be harmed by crime. So might offenders, by the way, but it's this orientation to harm. And what should mobilize us to act isn't the fact that someone has been so obnoxious as to break the law, but that people have been hurt. And that first and foremost must mobilize it. That first and foremost is what we pay attention to. Not the blame game, because we spend a lot of energy doing that. If we expended that energy instead in helping people who have been hurt or are hurting themselves, we'd be further ahead in our communities. And so that orientation to harm is generally understood in the restorative justice community and those who would know restorative justice. There is another aspect of harm, though, that isn't very often considered, that I keep in the forefront of my thinking, and that is just the fact that good intentions often develop into harms. The Walnut Street Jail, the first jail in the U.S., was a place where men went to contemplate, using a Bible, their deeds and create for themselves just a better future, all right? It developed into this monstrosity called the U.S. prison system, and that's not what people intended. That's not what original Quakers intended at Walnut Street. A lot of our innovations in the justice arena seem to go astray. And restorative justice has that identical potential, and there's plenty of evidence for it. Restorative justice has held out to victims and victim advocates in this country and other countries for a long time that this was going to be an invigorated, brand new approach, appreciation, and service for victims of crime. And it has not been. That's nonsense. In most communities where I give talks on restorative justice, and where there are a lot of restorative justice programs, all I have to do, and this is unfair, but I'm unfair, all I have to do is ask the question, how many programs do you have for victims of crime? And I barely see a hand. All right, so while it's very important to restorative justice, it's one of the 3 legs of the omnipotent stool, community, victim, and offender. We've done very little for victims. We've promised a lot. We've taken a lot of victim money for restorative justice programs, and we've just not delivered. All right, and victims around the country talk about this, victims groups, victims advocates talk about this. And so that concern with harm is harm reduction. Can we conduct ourselves such a way in our justice programs, like restorative justice programs, so as not to cause further harm? And victims would argue that with promises in restorative justice, that has caused further harm. Or, another example of harm reduction, do we program ourselves, that is, do we select cases in such a way that we perpetuate harms? So restorative justice has always set itself up as an alternative to conventional approaches to justice, where, of course, we don't do anything for victims. Well, how well has restorative justice, if it chooses, as the cases involved in its mediations, first-time white property offenders, if that's its case selection, how well does it do with victims of violence, for example? Are they as excluded in restorative justice programs as they are in conventional justice programs, and victims of violence being women and poor people and young people? So do we just kind of exclude those classes of victims much like we do in our other justice programs? And again, empirically, the answer is yes. And so this value of restorative justice is very important to me. Not the lip service we pay to the harm concept, but also paying very careful attention that we do not perpetuate harms or cause new harms in our new practice of justice. So I keep that in mind all the time. The second aspect of restorative justice, which is important to me and related, has to do with engagement. And again, this would be widely understood by people involved in restorative justice. It's not the one-off kind of mediation between parties in conflict. We expect, the imagery anyway, of restorative justice is that we significantly expand who those stakeholders are in some peaceful resolution. Because we recognize, we look at conflict perhaps a little bit differently, as more thick or more complex. So the fight last weekend only reveals a larger problem in the neighborhood. And a more restorative approach would be to involve more stakeholders in negotiating some kind of resolution to that, to the past, and in the present, so there's a clear place to go in the future without more conflict. So it's a popular idea in restorative justice, namely that there'll be more players, so to speak, at the table. But again, there's some concern that with our case selection, that we would seek to restrict those people who might have that kind of input. And engagement is an important issue in restorative justice, as you'll see in a minute. And the final idea, and then I'll get off this entirely and start talking about Northern Ireland, is a value called subsidiarity. Subsidiarity. And this is very important to me. I'm an old community organizer. And Christ, I'm in Chicago, so that's got to be okay, right? Subsidiarity is an idea that if conflict originates here in this local place, and we have a capacity in this local place to deal with it, then larger organizations ought not to run over us in the race to deal with local trouble. That there is a role, there ought to be a division of labor, where local places, local resources, indigenous leadership, indigenous capacity deal with trouble, and that the state has a different role. So subsidiarity in terms of restorative justice means that when we have organic development of organizations to do justice work, and this is a distinct possibility in conflict areas, because justice is on the table. It's not a theoretical classroom discussion about who ought to control justice. It's real. There are broad communities in Northern Ireland and elsewhere in conflict areas who do not want the police in their communities, who do not want the state involved with justice, who want a very decisive role in what happens to local offenders, useful and development. Right, and that's kind of the background. Subsidiarity would suggest they be properly resourced, and that capacity be developed, and they should handle what they can handle, and the state should help, not monopolize justice. All right, now let's go to Northern Ireland. I have done a shorthand. It's pretty vulgar, but it's here to just explain what's happening in Northern Ireland. And this is kind of the lecture to the post office as late as those 2 days before Christmas when I'm trying to send something out to Northern Ireland, and they're trying to find the postal rate for the place, and they keep punching in Ireland, all right, which does not give you the postal rate for Northern Ireland. Ireland, there's this island, and 32 counties on that island, and they're about the size of U.S. counties. 32 counties on that island are properly the Republic of Ireland. But in the far northeast of the island are 6 counties, which are Northern Ireland, which are part of the United Kingdom, right? Much as Wales and Scotland and England are. Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland are Great Britain. And so their rule is properly in Westminster, not in Dublin. All right? So these are distinct countries, if you will. And that's not just really understood. But it's a very small place. It's less than 2 people in the north and maybe 2 million people in the north and 4 million people in the south. And in total, just this number of counties. So it's a particularly small place, all the more ironic because it gets so much international attention. The troubles in Northern Ireland begin in 1968. It is certainly some of its heritage is the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. That figured obviously in what happened in Northern Ireland, but the troubles begin in the war in Northern Ireland begins in 1968 and goes for 30 years. So the second ceasefire is declared in Northern Ireland in 1997. People come to the negotiation table, which former judge and former Senator George Mitchell heads, and by Good Friday of the following year, 1998, the Belfast Accord is struck, this agreement. It's a noteworthy accord because it still stands. While government's been dissolved a number of times in Northern Ireland since then, peace accords haven't done so well in the last 25 years. This peace accord is still relatively intact in Northern Ireland, and the overt conflict in Northern Ireland ends. The chief protagonists in this conflict include loyalists, one segment of the community, which are called loyalists, unionists, or Protestants. And again, that's a fairly vulgar representation, but close enough. Loyalist is a term that I use because that's the working class term, and that's where all my work is, in working class communities. Unionist is a more middle class term, and overwhelmingly that group is Protestant. In this country, this is Protestant versus Catholic. I mean, that kind of sectarian conflict is what's prominent in what we know about the conflict in Northern Ireland. On the other side, the protagonists are Republican nationals, and overwhelmingly they are Catholic. Republican being more or less a working class term, but it's bigger than that actually. Nationalist is certainly a middle class term, and they are overwhelmingly Catholic. The aspirations of loyalists and unionists is to maintain some kind of a relationship with Great Britain, and certainly no relationship with the Republic of Ireland. What that relationship with Great Britain is not altogether clear. The community is very divided on this. Some want the absolute relationship straight line to Westminster. Others want a devolved state in Northern Ireland, but absolutely independent of the Republic of Ireland. The nationalist and Republican aspiration has been to unite the island. That is, all the counties. And the 38 county group is actually the name of a paramilitary group, but it's that aspiration of uniting all the counties together at some point. But within the Republican and nationalist camps, there are different visions of this now. And actually, the Belfast Accord required the Republic of Ireland to change its constitution and take out its aspiration to unite the entire island. And that accord, of course, was agreed north and south. And so and the other protagonist, of course, is the British state here. We sent a lot of troops into Northern Ireland, etc. And then in negotiating the settlement, the Republic of Ireland has been prominent, as was the United States and the Clinton administration, prominent in negotiating a final settlement in Northern Ireland. Okay, now to the meat of this presentation. I'm sorry for taking this long. One of the things that was discussed at the negotiation table as really a linchpin of the agreement was something called punishment violence. What had occurred since the late 1960s, so right from the beginning, and certainly was institutionalized by the late 70s, was the issue of punishment violence. And this, if you can imagine this imagery, it'll help. Northern Ireland, in urban areas anyway, are divided into estates, housing projects, some privately owned, most publicly held, in working class areas. And these are highly segregated. Catholics live here, Protestants live there, et cetera, et cetera. And in your particular estate, during the conflict, what you're faced with are rival paramilitary groups, like in a Protestant estate, Catholic paramilitary groups who you feel are preying on people who live in your particular state, the police who are shooting your boys in the back, Catholic or Protestant, it doesn't matter, and then all these British troops. And in working class areas, you really have no allies after a while. Everyone is versus the security forces versus the police. And the misconception is it's only Catholics or Republican areas that are faced with that. It's not true. But so you have all these forces on the outside digging at you in your estate. What you are not going to tolerate, and what you do not tolerate at all, are your own young people causing crime and mayhem internally. I mean, that's just the straw that breaks the camel's back. And what you have no local police, you rely on to sort that out, because they have a security function. They're not doing normal policing. When I came to Northern Ireland in 1997, there wasn't a single police officer there that had any experience in peacetime policing unless they had come from Europe. So they were security forces, adjunct to the security forces, and no one in these working class estates was about to invite the police in to deal with crime and antisocial behavior. It just wasn't going to happen. But what they did was they relied on the local boys, the local paramilitary groups, to sort it out. And so local paramilitary groups in all the nine major paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland, they include some dissident groups, got involved in policing activities in local areas. And it would operate like policing anywhere. Local citizens would call these guys up and say, so-and-so killed my dog, I want him killed, my daughter's sleeping around, I want her shot in the thighs, et cetera, et cetera. And they're developed, you know, and again, remember the culture's a highly violent culture, the community is backed up against the wall, they had no other options. And they feel these guys that came, men and women actually, from within the community as being obligated to them, and the military organizations take this on as a role. So they start doing policing. And their policing involves literally talking to people mostly. You know, we want you to stop this. And then cranking it up, a punishment tariff, including some very rough justice. And this was the concern at the negotiating table. And the rough justice is exiling people from the community. You've got 24 hours to get out of here. Shooting people in the knees, in the elbows, in the ankles, and just beating people up, and young people in particular. And so it's quite a level of community violence, intra-community violence, not inter-community conflict, but intra-community violence, which is highly institutionalized by the late 1970s. And this results in thousands of injuries and some deaths. All right, and people being exiled out of the country, just kicked out of the country by paramilitary groups. And it was known at the negotiating table that if you didn't get a handle on this, that the peace accord could fall apart. Because this wasn't as simple as sorting out conflict between rival groups. That's what the negotiations are all about. This is where communities were turning on themselves. And that was seen, I think, properly to be the much tougher proposition. What are we going to do about this? Well, what happened was nothing. So despite the fact that this is well known and given very serious consideration, there wasn't a single government program, there wasn't a single police program that materialized after 1997 that proposed to do anything at all about punishment violence. And this is a real mixed bag in local communities. Some people used it and liked it and demanded it, and other people felt it was just part of the terror. Right? The fact that these men would go around beating up kids, breaking into houses at night, dragging them out in the street, beating them with bats, taking them down alleys and shooting them, etc. I mean, this was all pretty widespread in these communities. And so with no programs developing, communities still had no options. So there's a point in 96 and 97 when a philanthropist stepped in, his agent stepped in, and offered to try and do something, at least to fund an effort to come up with alternatives to punishment violence in these local communities. And you know, this is one of the great lessons of our times. I never dreamed after doing this work for years that I would ever encounter a situation where someone could pay for a justice system. It's just like you have Gates and those kind of people out there paying to eradicate a disease, doing all these super state kind of activities. Here comes this guy who once owned all the duty-free shops in the world and sold them, who steps in and he can underwrite a community justice system in Northern Ireland to get rid of punishment violence. And so we went with this. So we had the bucks to do this. That was not the struggle, finding the money to do it. So the challenge was to come up with an alternative way to intervene when young people had kind of run amok in their communities, well known to the community, well known to the paramilitaries, and were scheduled, literally scheduled on a list to be beaten or shot when they were found. Right? That's what we're going to focus on. No fluff around the edges. Only those kids. That was the initial focus of these programs. And so we had to devise a program. Now, the referral source would be paramilitary groups. So this was going to be a tough sell because this was military activity. So what I'm asking men to do is to give it up. So instead of beating and shooting somebody and knowing that they have to save face, they would refer someone to a program. And someone on a program, on a scheme, that had to be acceptable to the community, and they couldn't screw up on that scheme or it was going to look bad for the paramilitary group that the community is leaning on to go out and deal with this young person. And when I talked to these guys on these punishment squads from all these paramilitary groups, it was like talking to local police sometimes. Because you know, they had the reputation of kind of being drooling psychopaths who like to beat up kids. But they were doing nothing more than responding to phone calls. They weren't proactive about this stuff at all. It was the community calling them and demanding, as part of their military work, that they sort out local trouble. And they also talked a lot like cops when you asked them, well, does it do any good? And that was usually the icebreaker talking to any group, because people would laugh, they would howl. Of course it does no good. You can shoot people repeatedly, you can beat people up repeatedly, and they still do what they do. There was a rather bizarre story I was told in the Twin Brook Pole Glass area where stealing cars and setting them afire, joyriding it's called, is pretty rampant and still is. And of this one particular individual who was notorious for doing this, who had been beaten and shot multiple times, the last time he was disabled. But the last time the paramilitary group found him, he had stolen a car from his wheelchair. I mean, it was just, you know, and they just throw up their hands with this kind of stuff. One guy told me, he goes, and he was the guy to do it, he goes, one night I authorized, I think it said 21 shootings in Belfast. And he goes, you know what happened the next day? And I'm really waiting for a punchline here. I said, no, what? He goes, nothing. It didn't change anything. Only 21 more people were shot, you know, from the night before. So military groups doing this knew it wasn't doing any good. They felt they were under a lot of pressure from the local community, their people, the same people that celebrated when they went into service, who kept in touch with them in the prisons, and who welcomed them back home, et cetera, et cetera. Those same people were demanding that they do this work. And this is about as dirty work as you can do in military, paramilitary service. No one wanted to do it. They would much rather be doing other things, but beating up kids and shooting kids was just at the bottom of the heap. So they had, and politically, this is very hard. Politically, in the peace process, you've got Sinn Féin aligned with Republican paramilitary groups, and the PUP aligned with loyal paramilitary groups. They're trying to make some headway politically, but their paramilitary groups are still beating and shooting kids. So politically, as a proposition, they wanted out of it as well. So the timing was pretty good. Communities had a huge appetite. We did a lot of research in communities. They had a huge appetite to get out of community violence, but they needed some options to do it. So we started setting up programs which began to look like community mediation programs in loyalist and Republican areas. And the trick was, and I'm not going to mince words with this one, the trick, of course, is if I'm a military man and you're asking me to give up wee Michael, who everyone thinks needs a good doing for what he's been up to, you want me to give him up to a program, don't ask me to call a college-educated 21-year-old and inquire about whether Michael can come in the program. The only person I'm going to talk to is somebody who's like me. And so we put into these programs at a very early stage prominent ex-combatants, guys that had been members of these organizations, that had served a lot of time in prison, that had huge reputations in the community and in the military. They headed up these programs. And I would call him, and I would call Tom and said, look, it's a race, Tom. Michael, we catch him, we're going to shoot him. You catch him and put him in your program, we'll leave him alone. And that's how we started this. So, you know, this was no big theory and no big promises. It was frank discussions with military men and women. Here's an alternative. You try it out. If it doesn't work, do what you do. And a lot of consultation with them, exactly what do you need? What does this program have to do? And that's how the programs were created. So nothing was taken off any bookshelf from any other country. We had to create these programs relevant for here. And let me give you an example of how this worked, all right? Let's use We Michael, and I'll take you through that process, and you'll see how it looks in the other programs. So, We Michael is actually the name of the first kid who was referred to the Greater Schenkel Alternatives Program, which is a loyalist program. And We Michael had a big reputation, but the bigger reputation was a family reputation. He had two brothers, one of which just was killed in a violent encounter this past summer. But he had two brothers who were rather notorious for crime and antisocial behavior. They had been beaten and shot multiple times by multiple loyalist paramilitary groups. They've just pissed off a lot of people, right? And here comes Michael. He's the youngest boy in the family going down the same road. The parents had an awful reputation. Drink too much, do drugs, really defiant in the community, took no responsibility for anything. So they were never considered a resource and more of a problem than anything else. Michael's coming down the pike. What he's been doing, he's been ripping off stores on the Schenkel Road. Everybody knows about that. But then breaking into homes of people, the only people more vulnerable than this little squirt of a kid, and that would be very elderly people. So he breaks into their homes and steals their stuff. And he's got this big reputation. UVF, Ulster Volunteer Force, is going after him. And that's the first referral to Tom Winstone, a celebrated ex-loyalist prisoner who's heading up the Greater Schenkel Alternatives Program. Tom and his staff contact Michael. He knows what's coming. It's on the street. They get his parents in. They have a discussion with him. Look, we've got an alternative for you. This is the agreement. If you go through this program successfully, the military group lifts its threat. It'll be gone. And if you don't want to go through this program, here's another program. And we had this backup, which was an existing program that would actually take an individual and their family out of Northern Ireland. So it wasn't ever a matter of turning Michael back to the street where he was going to get picked up, but there was another option where they would move his family either someplace else in Northern Ireland, down into the Republic, to England, or sometimes even to the United States. The program would just move them out. And Michael agreed to be involved in the program, so fine. This is what happens to Michael. He's supervised very closely, meaning 24/7. Someone's always in his face. You've got a youth worker who's in his face. And we're not going to ever talk about big numbers in these programs, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. So you're able to do this really intensive kind of work. And so he's got kind of a home curfew, but inevitably Michael's out on the street. Paramilitary guys working at night call Tom at home. Michael's out here, he's not supposed to be out here. You call the caseworker goes and gets him. This is like a ritual every night, probably for the first month. And it's like this with a lot of kids. Paramilitary groups, to their credit, are pretty tolerant. They're not stupid. They know where Michael comes from. They know the likelihood that he's going to become a saint tomorrow, right? And they're pretty tolerant, but they don't want trouble from him. But they know where he's not supposed to be. So, you got a community looking out after Michael. Not the nicest imagery. They're not looking out for him like you need some candy. They're looking out to get his ass. But you just got a lot of people involved in that, right? And so that's how it goes with Michael. And what he has to do initially in this program is he has to write a contract. Now, he's a caseworker who's going to help him write it. He has to come up with this contract, and he has to have at least these three major elements. Michael must say in his contract what amends he's going to make to victims. That means to be stated explicitly. What's the plan? All right, and so for Michael, face-to-face meetings with victims, sweeping out shops on the Schenkel Road for a period of time. I'm sorry, that wasn't part of that. It was meeting with victims, returning stuff he had stolen, or providing services to victims. He did their gardens, he did their lawns for the summer, for most of those victims. So that was in his contract. A second element of his contract was, what is he going to do for the community he's been causing mayhem in? And his community service, the primary part of his community service, was for a number of months sweeping out those shops in the Schenkel Road that he'd been ripping off. So, after hours, he'd just sweep out the shops. And the third element, and the hardest element of this contract, was what was Michael going to do for himself? This is kind of the preventive stuff. How do we change Michael and get him to participate in that? And so he would have to go down a series of activities, such as getting re-engaged in school. Now, no school would have him, but he got hooked up with tutors. you know, drug and alcohol screening and treatment, counseling, joining a gym, getting a bank account, all these kind of conventional things for a kid his age. By the way, Michael's pretty young. He is not a teenager yet when he first gets involved in this program. So a bunch of, you know, conventional activities, things that Michael does to build up himself. And then a community group, 3 of you from the local community agree to come in and listen to Michael's presentation. You agree to come back in when he's done to listen to it a second time to see if you're satisfied that he's completed everything he said he'd do. The community makes a judgment about whether the contract's enough. This thing for victims, that's not enough. You need to do this other stuff too. Whatever it is, they end up with this contract, this plan for Michael. And that's what he does for the next 8, 9, 10 months. He's there all the time doing these kinds of activities with someone in his face doing that. Now, what happened immediately, we didn't expect this. The deal we had struck was if Michael goes successfully through this program, the threat is lifted in the community. The military didn't want to bother with that. Once Michael went into the program, the threat was lifted. So that's great for us. That happened almost immediately. And we developed programs like this in loyalist working class areas and Republican working class areas too. And the philanthropists underwrote a number of these programs which we've evaluated and monitored over the years. Now, I want to very quickly tell you what's happened in these programs. The punchline is we got about 540 kids that went through these programs. That's 540 kids who weren't beaten or shot. All right, and we consider that a pretty significant development. One of the things we discovered very early on is that if we were pretty strategic, if we were clever in identifying this caseload, that we had a disproportionate effect on crime and violence in the community. So the Greater Shankill Alternatives Program never had more than 15 kids in the program at any point in time, but in a community of approximately 40,000, the area where they worked, you could have a remarkable effect on crime and antisocial behavior and punishment violence and attacks on cops and recruiting of even younger people into crime if you chose the right 12 to 15 kids. And we should have known about this, but it really caused us to do things in the program so we had those kids. So it was never about numbers. It was never a demand for high numbers. It was a demand for the correct identification, the correct targeting of the kids involved in the most trouble, the ones most likely to get beaten and shot. So that's one thing we discovered early on. Another thing that we started to see over the years is that the community that was demanding that paramilitaries do this dirty work for them now was coming to these organizations first, not last, but coming first. So they're cutting the military out of it completely. So victims might approach, or advocates of victims might approach the organization, or very worried parents would approach the organization. Look, I think my kid's going to get done if we don't do something. And you know, these programs would then verify that indeed a young person had risen to that level in stature in the community, and you know, and on and on. So the community started coming around, which to me demonstrates that some people in the community anyway feel they now have an option, a viable option to the violence, right? And over a period of these years, these 7 years that we've had programming, we have more and more people approaching the projects directly and cutting out the military. We've also been training up people in the military in mediation skills, for example, and they do their work, their normal work, differently than they ever have before. They do a lot more talking and a lot more telling than they've ever done before. So they have themselves reduced the incidence of punishment violence. And then over a period of years, we have areas in Northern Ireland where this has gone down precipitously. Punishment violence, threat and exclusion has gone to 0 in some areas, or very low numbers in other areas where we have programs. There's just, no one disputes that fact. Police who hate these programs, government who hate these programs because they're community-led programs and they don't control them, have to concede that this type of punishment violence has gone down very, very low, to 0. So the second largest city in Northern Ireland, Derry, Londonderry, in the Republican area, which is the largest part of the city, it's been 0 for 3 years now. And the provisional IRA has announced a decommissioning this year of the organization. They've made significant demonstrations of putting weapons beyond use. Preceding that July announcement for several months, it had gone to zero in several of the most heavily populated Republican areas in Northern Ireland. Areas that are controlled by the UVF around Belfast, it has gone to nearly zero in those areas. And those were some of the highest areas of punishment violence. And there's been no particular trick to it except you developed an alternative which has credibility, which has impact, and the military can save face, and they want out of the punishment business anyway. They can save face, and increasingly the communities comes to see this. Absent a police force and a normal justice system, they come to see this as a viable alternative for them as well. And the programs have been, I think, largely effective in dealing with a lot of dead-end kids that have washed out of the conventional justice system. The conventional justice system is just waiting for them to get old enough to graduate into jail. That's essentially what the game is. But a lot of those kids that have washed out of the conventional justice system have done quite well on these schemes. And that leads me to the last observation about these schemes. What is that all about? Why have they done particularly well? And here's the observation. I can go into Northern Ireland now, where I'm reasonably well known in areas of these projects, and see kids that I knew that were on the scheme 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and they're hanging out in the office. So I can go into the Greater Shankill Alternatives program, and Michael still comes around in that program. And his purpose is to smoke and to drink black coffee and to harass the staff. But he brings his friends in with him, et cetera, et cetera. And I've never gone into a probation office in the United States and seen former probationers just kind of hanging out. So I got to ask, well, what the hell is this all about? And some of our findings as well, that some of the kids who washed out of the program, that didn't complete their contract successfully, even after a period of months in the program, still do pretty well after the program. They don't screw up. Because you ask the paramilitaries, they know. And no, you don't get those kind of reports. So what is that all about? You don't even need to successfully complete the program. So we don't know. We suspect that the relationship between those caseworkers is the most significant relationship with an adult that a lot of these kids have ever had. And that would generally fit the profile of these kids. They don't have successful relationships with adults at home or at school or anywhere in the community, but they've done well in this program. And that's caused us to kind of rethink credentialing a little bit. So we're not out looking for the brightest, the best degrees. We're looking for Pied Pipers. And if we hire Davey McCullough, look, he's tattooed from his neck to his ankles. And he's done big prison time. He's got a big reputation in the community. But those boys follow him around like a puppy. And David doesn't do bombs anymore or guns anymore. He's doing community development and community justice work. And as long as I got a bunch of guys on street corners in Belfast who aspire to be ex-prisoners, I've got to use some ex-prisoners who are going down a different route to lead some of these kids in a new direction. And Davey does great with these guys, these tough, young guys who want a war and want to be part of a war. And here's Davey taking them down this more peaceful path. And the first woman we hired in these programs, who now directs them on the loyalist side, part of her whole regimen with these young girls who were just as violent as the boys were, just as washed out from the conventional system. Her regimen included how do you dress, how do you put up makeup. She's very attractive, and she was just like a magnet for these young girls as well from the Greater Shankill area, and she set up, female after-school programs for them, et cetera, et cetera. We needed people like that because that relationship was going to be fundamental and deterministic. How well these kids related to the caseworker would have a very significant impact on how they behave in the community and into the future. So again, we got 540 of these kids who would have been beaten or shot were it not for these alternative programs. And that's the programs. This is part of the grist of community peace building, are programs like this. And the programs, as their work goes down in punishment violence, begin to look more and more like your program. More and more different kinds of cases are coming in the door. neighborhood disputes, et cetera, et cetera. They look like a community mediation center now, but they were set up with this very specific purpose and are kind of working themselves out of that job. They've been, I think, wildly successful. A lot of people in Northern Ireland, in statutory organizations and political parties and public office, are wild about restorative justice. No problem with restorative justice. They love the message, but they cannot stand the messenger. That's the politics of this in Northern Ireland, because we've involved about 50 men and women who are former combatants, who have prison terms, in their background, who do community justice work, right? And have, I absolutely count on the identical commitment to community and cause and family that they had when they had bombs and rifles as in the work they do today. Under dramatically changed circumstances, no bombs and no rifles, they have that same kind of commitment to justice work. And it's really very decisive in these working class communities. And that idea of engagement that I talked about originally in these kinds of societies means inclusivity. You cannot exclude ex-prisoners in a place like Northern Ireland. As much as people would like to, you can't, because they number in the thousands in this relatively small place. So to have an inclusive society and to respect human rights and just to be smart about peace building, those that elect to be involved in these kind of processes have to be included. But that, you don't see that kind of peace building on the news, and you never will. But peace building is like that. There is this kind of political bright lights peace process, the track one stuff, which is put on the news, and that's all you pretty much read about. But peace building is a much longer term project, and programs like this, I think, make a very significant contribution to that. That's me. Stop talking at that. Questions? Yes?
I missed beginning part.
I covered it there.
When you were giving
Yeah, okay.
some of the background, but so I'm assuming that this gap in maybe like the RUC's credibility or something like that existed well before Good Friday in certain communities, and so that's leading me to the question: was there more of a prevalence of this punishment violence, and maybe one of the communities over the other going back, into maybe even, to the beginning of the Troubles, 65, 66, 67?
No, actually, everyone occurred in both communities. Now it's overwhelmingly loyalist communities, but that's a function of the July statement, et cetera. But and there's paramilitary groups that do not have programs like this. We're just in the earliest discussions with some groups in some areas about setting up these alternative programs. So right now, it's a lot of this is loyalist. Now, punishment violence is not only regarding young people who commit crimes. Punishment violence is what I also use to maintain the internal military discipline. So as the vicious stuff happens to you within the military, these paramilitary groups, or involved in drugs and extortion stuff, punishment violence is used there as well. And these programs have never proposed to get involved in that. They have. They have started trying to sort some of this out, and we think some of the groups practice a lot less punishment violence for internal discipline than they have in the past. But these programs just focused on the community crime stuff.
Because my understanding is that now, especially the loyalist community, that a lot of the violence is related to maybe the drug trade, the more traditional sort of, I don't know how you would say it, mafia type activities, and I'm wondering if there's a way that this sort of model can branch out. Where does it come up against a certain?
What's likely going to happen is that those organizations, as they seek some political leverage, will get out of the business. They'll give up their members involved in the drug trade. I think the UVF this year will probably make a decommissioning statement, that's my guess. And they will warn members involved in the drug trade they're going to do that, and then just deliver them to the police. And it'll be a police problem, a normal policing kind of problem. I think that's likely to happen. There's a lot of pressure on the groups to decommission or to reconstitute themselves into a civil kind of organization, and it'll take care of a lot of that, I think. But there'll still be a lot of drug trade, but it'll be the enterprising individuals and not under the aegis of an organized military.
No, that's okay.
Are you aware of any types of restorative justice programs like this that are going on in the West Bank and Gaza?
No. I'm aware, because they've been students of mine, of people from that region who ask questions about those kinds of programs. But in almost any, and there will be this issue that's come up, local control of justice and prevalence of armed groups in the administration of justice in almost any conflict area is an issue, and it will be an issue negotiated. And it's just as what do we do with prisoners will be negotiated in any peace deal. There's going to be this discussion, but it's a fixture almost of any conflict area where normal policing breaks down, where policing becomes part of the security services. What steps into the vacuum in terms of internal crime issues? What often steps into the vacuum is pretty rough justice, which is administered by armed people. So it has to be part of, sooner or later, it has to be part of the discussion. What do you do to build up the confidence of communities in nonviolent approaches?
So you see a lot of uses for it possibly in the future in those areas?
Yeah, I'm not sure this program prescription would ever work. I'd be really leery about trying to transport it anyplace. But the idea that, you've got to talk to military, you've got to talk to terrorists, that's what I do. I give aid and comfort to military organizations, which is against the law in this country and is against British law. But what I do is I talk. And the discussion is, okay, for a variety of reasons you don't want to do this work, what do you need? What do you need in its place? How do you save face? What kind of assurances? What kind of performance do you need? I'm going to have a real pragmatic discussion, and I've had these with people about what is it going to take for you to trust something else? Who's got to be involved in that program? On and on. We're going to have those kinds of discussions. So that bit is portable. You've got to have these communications. You can't go in and pretend that a peace deal, a political peace deal, is going to take care of stuff on the streets. I mean, they just don't talk to each other. Oftentimes, the stuff in the streets precedes a political peace deal and is long extended in the future. I mean, we just have these distorted notions of what goes on in conflict areas. And I've got military groups that, talk to me all the time about how they're underappreciated for keeping the local peace. Yeah, everybody wants us gone, but do they have any idea that we keep a lid on this place during July, or we keep a lid on this place in interface areas? And no one wants to admit that, but they make a good point. So there's all this work to do on the ground. How do you get military organizations to change? So here's these dramatically changed circumstances. The war is over. Do we agree the war is over? What evidence do you need that the war is over? Okay, if the war is over, what about your recruitment of young people into the military organization? Is that going to stop? Do people in the military organization, are they free to leave it? That's a huge issue. What happens to the weapons in this organization? And there's all these, discussions. They have to be discussions. And those groups want to know, well, what did this group do in Northern Ireland? What happened to this group in South Africa? They would like some comparative experience so they know how to move forward. But all these assumptions we often make that, okay, we got a peace deal, go away. Or we got a peace deal, here's, develop your computer skills kind of programs, really don't deal with the meat of a lot of this stuff. And one part of that is the communities develop these ravenous appetites for violence, because they're just very, very punitive. They become incredibly intolerant of young people, for example. And they have no options. So you got to develop options. I don't think we're any different than that in American communities. People feel they don't have options. And look, violence works great. I can't make a moral claim with a young person who's violent. Say, well, you should not do that. That's totally irrelevant. That person's life in that context, violence is what works. It's the only thing that works. You're going to have to really sell them that there's an alternative route to go. That you could be a man in a different way. You could be fulfilled in a fundamentally different way than by killing somebody or getting ahead on their back. That has to be taught, and you have to give demonstrations that that's a possibility for people to change. Our moral claims and our laws are not going to have any impact on them at all. It will break the laws, it will reject moral claims.
And it seems like that's what a boss is coming up against in the territories. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but you know, he does not. The Israeli government would like him to really crack down on the various militant organizations, but he really can't. I mean, you know, even if he had an iron will to do that, it's beyond the pale of his control at this point.
We have a fundamental reluctance that comes out of the United States, I think. Reagan era days, we have a fundamental reluctance and even a moral attitude towards engaging with these people, however they're defined. But the idea there's some contagion effect or legitimation effect. If I talk to a terrorist, I'm going to become a terrorist. I'm selling my soul, or that I give them credibility because I look them in the eye, I pay them some respect, and I have a conversation. I mean, that just runs so contrary to what I learned as a mediator in terms of facilitating anything. He just has to be rejected on his hand. It just doesn't. It doesn't work. It's not going to bring a sustainable peace to behave in that